in April, you have a previous notification of that, or is it March? March, sorry. It'll be actually before the next talk. If you know anyone who's not getting, people have come to me over the last few weeks. During the COVID period, there was a period when our old membership, some of them didn't register or get onto the new database. So anybody who's not getting notifications, and there are a few which we have rectified, give us your email, either myself or Anthony, whatever it is, and we'll put it in. We deal with emails all the time because the postal service is excessive, really. We couldn't operate with it. So without further ado, I think I'll get the Reverend Batchelor to introduce the speaker tonight. All right, John?
Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Harnett doesn't need any introduction here this evening, because those of you who were here at his last talk, I'm sure you appreciate it, and that's probably why you've come here this evening again, and I assure you you'll not be disappointed. Michael is very gifted. He's a gifted historian, and I, for one, count it a privilege and a blessing to be able to stay here in his presence and listen to what he has to say to us. Now, he could talk to us about many things, and I was looking through one of his first books, and I came across the shootout at the OK Corral. Now, he knows what I'm referring to, but I'm not going to ask him to talk about that here this evening, because if he did that, that would lead on to other things, and then you wouldn't hear the topic that he's come prepared to give us here. Michael, we give you a very warm welcome here, and you just feel at ease because you're in the company of friends.
Okay, I have a real, I'm afraid, a fairly long agenda here. I hope it doesn't seem like it. But I'm going to start off by sort of recapping in 5 minutes the last lecture of about an hour, because it's important and I'd like it has relevance to the next part. So let's just jump straight into it. I started at 12,800 BCE, and that was when the asteroid hit. It basically brought an end to the Ice Age. And it also, at that stage, and it was an apocalypse, to say the least. When it landed, it put up material out of space that landed down as meteorites, again, burning the whole planet. There was up to 4 inches of ash around it. It was basically a sixth of the size of the asteroid that destroyed the dinosaurs. And if it had been any bigger at all, we wouldn't be here at all. So it was that sort of size of damage, and that devastated the people there. But as you'll see in this talk coming through, there was a pretty civilized society before the asteroid hit. And I hope to show you that during this talk that it was the remnants of that society that regrouped and became the Irish people, among others. So I showed you that the sea levels were 400 foot lower. The green area that is sea today was, at that stage, it was dry land, and that's where the majority of the people would have been living. I also showed you Malta as an example of where civilization, the little island of Malta, people lived on it, and it continued to live after the sea flooded. So I just wanted to show that come forward. I want to rush through it. I showed you in Malta that there was signs of civilization before the flood or the rising of the seas. And by that is the extensive tracks which go right across the island in various places and continue under the sea. So they're obviously created by man before the sea levels rose, which is basically 12,800 years ago. Coming forward, I then talked about what was the remnants of the society. And I showed you 3 sites, the Gobelki Tepe, and this was, they call it a temple, but I don't like temples anymore, and you'll see why. And I don't like temples in society, basically, at all. And I'll explain that a little bit later on why. It was an important place, and I think the best thing that can be said for it is it was probably a warning to future generations. There's a lot of work being done, and that slab, I talked about it last time, and I'm not going to go back over that. This was Catalhoyhook, and I still can't pronounce it properly, but that was an artist's impression of what they found on the remains underground. No churches, no central halls, no palaces, all very equal, everyone together, and a pretty high level of sophistication. You could live in the houses today. You know, there was heating, boiler inside, there was the everything you needed. The door was in through the roof, that was a bit of protection. Walls were painted, and this is 10,000 BCE, 12,000 years ago. So this is only 2,000 years after that apocalypse. Found marble statues at that time. These people were capable. I'd ask any of you to go out and carve a marble statue tomorrow. Even with modern tools, you'll have difficulty. This was, again, 12,000 years ago, 10,000 BCE. The same marble statues I saw in Malta several thousand years later. I then talked about Gobistan, the technology. There was the Viking-type boats, as seen. And again, I'm talking about 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. So I'm giving you a pretty sophisticated peoples that were in before that. I then moved on to the a country that was called, according to the Scythian books, Afrig. And it was, and I went into depth on how the country was produced, and I'm not going to go through that again, other to say there was a country which is now mostly covered or completely covered by the Black Sea. It was a lot bigger area than that, in that it did go into the steppes, etc. And this was where the Scythian people really moved forward. The city that was there before, the Catalhoyhook, was abandoned when this country came available because it was the highly fertile lands. So they moved from about 7,000 BCE into this land, but then this land catastrophically flooded and they were all knocked out within a year in 5,700 BCE. They had at that time, I remind you, milk products, barley, farming products. They had technology, metals. All of these things were well known of at this period. I then moved on and showed you that when that Black Sea area flooded, they went in all directions. But what only those people specifically moving in all directions, they brought with them technologies that were pretty well new to the world. The metalworking abilities, farming. Most of the people had sort of regressed after that apocalypse to hunter-gatherers, living day to day. If they could get an animal, they lived for a few days. If they didn't, they starved. They didn't have time to have grandparents because the grandparents couldn't survive as much because they couldn't predict their food going forward. So that meant there wasn't another generation to teach the young ones. So it was society was very limited at those times. But once you could start farming, you could settle down homes, you could have food on demand. It suddenly meant that people lived longer. Those incapacitated to maybe hunt were perfectly capable of passing on knowledge. So farming made a huge difference to people across the board. I talked about how Cessa and her, according to our ancient documents, and her 50 tribes, or her 50 maidens as they're referred to, the ones that ended up in Ireland, She first went to Egypt, and Egypt comes again over and over again in our Irish society, much more so than you might see, and you'll see it again in this talk. Other people, which I want to mention at this stage, everyone when they abandoned it, a lot of them went into Babel. That was the sort of grain heartlands. That was probably the heartlands of a lot of the society. But then there were far too many people. And once again, they moved out. A number of them went to Capacinterunt. Capacinterunt, which in 4,000 years later became basically, 3,000 years later, became the Israelites. But they first went to Egypt to do the building. They were given their own area. They were actually looked after quite well at that stage. They were good builders. They were well acknowledged. We'll come to them again later in this talk as well. The Hittites basically would have been the Scythians that transported out, and then the others went up the rivers, bringing farming with them, encountering the whole time hunter-gatherers and showing them farming techniques. And then the green one was the Mongols, which again we'll refer to a bit later on. So, okay. I then by that stage had got you back to Ireland, and I'm just going back to the previous guide. Remember when St.C. first went down to the Sudan in Egypt, south of the High Egypt, she then went back to the Caspian Sea, gathered her people and came to Ireland. At the same time, the Fomorians came to Ireland. All this was in the previous talk, so I don't want to go on too long at that over this one. The settled in Ireland, the west of Ireland, was probably the Fomorian area more than any. This was pretty well only farming. There was a bit of metalworking, a little bit of copper, but it was very much, I think, a sort of supply to the Fomorians coming through the group. I then spoke also how after that, with the people all moving out into the different natures, then we start to see something new, and that was trading. And suddenly, instead of, before that, most countries would have done their own metalwork. They wouldn't have been trading with so much with others. Yes, they might have got the odd materials, but now trading took off big time. And they became the two of the first superpowers. One was Egypt, and Egypt said, oh, great, we can go and take other countries and get other people to do work for us. And if we do that, so they invaded the whole of North Africa, lying along the Mediterranean by chariot. The Hittites were a little bit more clever. They didn't quite attack them as such, but they used persuasion, fairly strong persuasion, and in later years backed up by military force. And in the middle were the sea people, the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians basically, as with all the other sea people on that screen, but they were the sort of the chosen one, and they acted as the sailors, the transport routes to the Egyptians and the Hittites. They started off with Egypt bringing things like cedar of Lebanon wood, which wood was very hard to come by, or good building wood, and that was where they started to make their empire. And the Phoenicians, in fact, became a superpower as powerful as any of the others, despite having no land, or practically no land. But their trading empire was impressive. Right, this is where we basically start this talk. And what I'm going to say here now is that the trade was probably more detrimental to people than the asteroid. That is quite a dramatic thing. It changed the world big time for various reasons. And trade started because there was local expertise in different parts of the world, there were local resources, and some places grew things better, regional weather, regional changes. But for the first time in society, people were being bought. You know, you just needed resources and people were being bought. The whole emphasis of society changed. And also for some of the first times, as you'll see, you started to get a pyramid structure with a leader at the very top and a whole pyramid coming down. And again, that'll become evident as we go through. And that trading also created sort of barriers, cultural barriers, or barriers between the superpower people and the rest of the world. The most easy that you'll be used to knowing of is the Roman Empire collapse. The rest of the people didn't like it when the Romans, and they came in, and that was another similar example. So the first question is worth asking is, what was the new Irish society like? Was it different? Was it new? There were expert people that were the leaders in technology and advance just to get to Ireland. Remember, we were always thinking there were bits of Curragh, and that was the height of it. No, they didn't. They had ships capable of carrying 20 tons of materials. They were well advanced technically. They were the sort of entrepreneurs, and they went to set up a new society. So did they set up a society that was different, new? And it appears probably not, as we'll come into. So I want to look at the new society through different lenses, different ways of looking at it. And the first thing to explain is the Irish society was set up as clans or septs, which is a smaller part of it. And basically they were a family. So you didn't have, as we have today in a society, father, mother, 2.4 children. The broader family was your family. You saw them as such. And while we maybe in our society go to a grandfather and a grandchild, in the Irish society would have gone even 2 generations both way, and all of your cousins outways. So if you think of a clan as an extended family, and that's what clans really were. And that, they didn't have ownership as such. The clan might have owned or managed a territory, and I'm talking about the clans, not much later situations. So people didn't own their individual land as such. The leader might have been allocated a bigger area and different structures within it, but the whole area belonged to the clan. And that meant that if you sort of saw someone that was maybe apparently to us a long way away, they were just as important to you as your son or your close family is to us today. And that was the way they would have seen it. Fostering, I'm going to mention again, and it'll come later on in the next talk a bit more, but fostering was a child that was born, no matter how it was born, or whatever the cause of the conception, and there were 9 different ways of conception, or maybe 1 way of conception, but 9 ways of identifying it. In that society, the child was always considered as a full-bodied member in their own right, no matter how it was. And yet today in our society, if someone had a terrible reputation or something, that is a stigma that carries through with the child right through its life often, in many cases. In this society, it was absolutely not. It would have carried the status of the parents, no matter who they were, but it would not have carried the stigma or any of that nature. So the children, as soon as they were weaned, someone else looked after them. They were still your children, and I'm not going into depth too much on that thing. No one actually owned anything as such specifically. The family owned it. Regular clan gatherings, which was big. Complete equality of sexes. And that's something, again, which we don't really see often. There was no difference. The Brecon laws were very clear on that point. Complete equality of everybody. Women could be leaders. They could be warriors. And in frequent words. And everyone's role was respected right through the whole layer of society. Just to put it in modern societies, and I'm thinking of a famous TV series a long time ago, what would we do without our telephone sanitary operators? Everybody had an important job, to clean the telephones. Everyone had an important job, and they were respected for that job. So we're looking at how the sands were done. So I then started to look at what parts of the world were women considered equal? And I sort of drew rather crudely this map, but those societies were all, women could be leaders, they could be warriors. The Mongols is the famous one, the top right-hand corner. The Mongols, 1/3 of all the kurgans, which is the sort of burial mounds for them, were of warrior women. And they were about 5'7", the average height of them, and there's quite a few of them. Down the Berbers in North Africa, the Fulani, right down to South America, across to America, Southern Africa. Every one of those societies tended to have women as almost equals. I say not almost, as equals. Sorry, I don't mean it. They're coming through there. So, so the Celtic, as we call it now, the Celtic society, wasn't any different from any of those areas. But there's a big distinction, you notice. The superpower areas don't fit in. They don't show in there at all. So then I wanted to look next at the legal system. How is this society organized? And the first thing, which most of you probably, hopefully you do realize, the chieftain was not a mini king. He was not inherited at his role. He was elected. He was near close to a president. It was ethically wrong for him to have a right. Now, families tended to go through, but they were still elected and come through. If they were being trained to be the chieftain, as in from birth, they would have carried the chieftain status coming through. But they were not automatically made leader. That had to be chosen by the Parliament committee, the group. And I'm not going into all the Irish names at the moment. But there were 4 major types of people which made up that, I'm going to use the word Parliament. There were the chieftain's family, or the chief of the nobles chosen from. There were the brehons, the druids, and the bards. And between them, they made the decisions. Now, the frontispiece was the chieftain, the one that was all done in the name, a bit like a president. So, where did I come to next? So, again, this is the most complex, I think, of the scales. Firstly, men and women were completely equal in the eyes of the law. But the law was based on customary law. It was not written by a leader and everybody follows it. There was no statute put out by it was built over the decades, centuries, millennia, and a lot of it goes back earlier. So customary law is where, and it's often transmitted orally from the societies, and that doesn't mean it was simple. The law became incredibly complex. It covered land, it covered people, it covered animals. If I had a beehive, I had to give the people around me some of the honey for a number of years because the bees were stealing from the other areas which people were using. So, but in time, when they got their own hives, and I had to give them a hive every year when the hive split, they would give it back to me. So I ended up with the same amount, but the society and the ended up being much better. But the law covered everything. They also covered very complex things such as compensation, securities, honor price. And again, people inherently liked the law. Well, if you go down 35 miles an hour through Ben Burb today, most people wouldn't notice, or some people might bits and pieces. It's not. But if you did it in those days, you would be really noticed. You wouldn't do it because you were basically upsetting, you were flouting the law, and there was a genuine love of what was right. It was flexible. And the law was flexible in that if I went and stole from the shop, I would be punished immediately by the current law. But in Bracken's days, depends why I went from the shop. If I had nothing at all, and I was across to bread that I was going, that was not a crime, and no one would have seen it a crime. If I was a pregnant lady and I had a craving for something and I stole that, that wasn't a crime. In fact, if I was a pregnant lady and my husband denied me what that craving was, that was a crime, which is quite a way to think of it. The role of the Brehons would have been to, I'm not saying administer the law, but they had to make decisions, if necessary, the common decisions, and they leveled between different tribes. So each tribe would have had its own Brehons, but overall, there would have been traveling Brehons that would have leveled that out. Local governance, everyone have mentioned that, and enduring influence. We are used to hearing about the brilliance of the English legal system, you know, the Magna Carta, the pinnacle of the start of law. That was Brehon law. It's taken straight Brehon law. 12-men jury, Brehon law. And yet it's not seen as such. Sorry, I've gone on a little bit long in that one. So where do we find legislation that is not based on punishment, which is what normally we're used to, but based on undoing the harm that we'd done. And the map, you look again, is pretty well the same as the last one. Everywhere around that doesn't have the superpowers had that same function, that same idea. They're based on individuality, the importance of people. So what about beliefs? That's the next big question. And again, I started to look at society through their beliefs. And what were their beliefs? And again, this is the second big things. Firstly, I remember last day, and I'll come to it in a few moments, I talked about there were two types of all religions fall into one of two science, one of two groups. In the beginning, there was this, God made everything out of chaos, made himself into chaos, and everything was made from it. And animism would follow that. And animism without the worship aspect. Because animism is now being called as spiritual worship. Worship itself wasn't something that happened. Because why would you worship yourself, or why would you worship another part of you? If you were made of the same essence as the earth, or the rivers, or the mountain, or the cosmos, why would you worship it? Because worship suggests something that is outside of you. And the whole idea was that if, even in the Irish Christian version, which I'm going to come on to the next bit, the Irish Christian version sort of would have believed you were made in God's essence. You were made in God's image. You weren't separate from it. You were made as in God's image. And that would have been very much the Irish viewpoint. God wasn't something out there. It was something that was all around us. It was inherent in everything. I'm going to jump to the Vedic scriptures in the next bit. There was a spirit or energy. And again, because these go right around the world, there were the three gunas, which many of you, if you've done meditation or if you've done even just go into some of the philosophies, the three energies are tamas, rajas, and sattva. You'll all know it, you've all experienced it, and yet you won't know it by those names necessarily. Rajas is when you're all excited, you're ready to go, it's early morning, it's bright, it's youth, it's enthusiasm. Tamas is sort of lazy, lackadaisical, an old river, just taking it nice and easy. And sattva is being one with nature. If some of you play golf and you've done the perfect swing, you didn't think about it, the ball's going exactly where you wanted it, it may or may not do a hole in one. You know that feeling, you're at one with it. You're doing a job and you're happy with the job. You don't realize the time. It might be hard labor, but you're confident. You're in the moment, as we call it. That is when you're experiencing the energy sattva. So again, that would have been very much the idea, the energies that flow through all of us. Interconnectedness. We were all completely interconnected coming through, and that's why there was a thing, for example, astrology. We were connected to the stars. We were connected to where the earth and everything else, and that's why it was so important. Sacredness in nature. Just as we talk about the body being a temple, the whole of nature was the temple because it's the same essence as us, and that was the coming through. We were all the chaos made from God. Ancestor reverence, time, and it could be very complex, let's not run down this. Time in an Irish belief was almost like a cycle. There was no straight line. In many beliefs you have a straight line. You begin, you end, you die, and then you go to heaven. And that's it forevermore. In Ireland, there was much more repeating. Your units were recycled. You were part of your ancestors. You were all together. And that came under shamanism and the respect for nature. I'm going to go on because I've got a lot more to go. So if you ever wanted a sign, this was for me last night. And I took the dogs just on the edge of dark for a walk. And I was just thinking about bits and pieces and spirits and I just got stopped dead in the middle of my lawn when I saw that. And that's the hat I usually wear. And I thought, my goodness. So I just thought, look, that was that point. But I just said, I might talk this story through, and the big point comes in a moment. So I put it onto this presentation. And the AI automatically wrote those words. Now, if we go back into our old society, that would have been a sign, a very clear sign. That was, something. Just that's fungi that's been made there for hundreds of years and just grown in that shape. I never saw it before, and it's just sometimes you see it. But there's AI at work. That is our future. On some record now that's logged into the internet, it's going to say, how many people stand on grassy ground? That is a person standing on grassy ground. It isn't a reflection, it isn't a thing, that is just growing in the grass. So I'm trying to give you, even the AI that's ahead of us is thinking the same way as our ancients, and many do today. This one, I want you to look at the circle, and in that circle is Ireland, at least Northern Ireland, 540 million years ago. But I want you to look at this next video for the next minutes, and I want you to imagine being an alien or looking at it through a microscope, and I want to ask you one question. If time was not 540 million, but 5 minutes, is this living or not? Let's go. And there's no sound. Remember that circle where it was? And this absolutely amazes me. I don't know, I've seen it quite a few times, and it's relevant here. What am I showing you geology for? This is how they see the world living, and partly. The bit at the bottom that's coming up is England. Southern Ireland and England is now just crashing and making the highest mountains. Some of the highest the world has ever known. That churning of the mountains is where we have so much gold and raw materials. That's why Ireland is so successful. The light bit is under shallow seas. I should have said at the very start when I circled that bit, if you go to Greencastle near Mill Bay, that is the bit of Carboniferous comp, which is the little animals that lived at the bottom of the sea, made the limestone. That limestone was created 540 million years ago. The dinosaurs arrive about this time. That's 300 million years later. But look at the movement. Look at the, if this was in a Petri disc, or looking through a microscope, you'd say that's living. Do you recognize the world yet? Oh, sorry. I shouldn't have done that. Go on. Play again. What I wanted to do was that. That becomes India. Sorry about that. In the middle of the screen, you see Africa. But you'll also see that the UK by now, and Ireland, is pretty well where we are today. And that's 170 million years ago. No Atlantic Ocean. That's shoot. Sorry. Go on. Play. Play. Well, I'm trying to do it now. Watch there. That's India. At some speed, crashes into Asia. Dinosaurs die now. Atlantic's opening up. Man comes on the scene about now. Sorry about those disturbances. Right. So the last lens I wanted to look at, how when you look at that, you can sort of get a feeling of a living planet, to say the least, or at least a moving planet. Now, the last one I want to look at is the infrastructure, and the sort of what we call Neolithic infrastructure. And at that point, I've got 3 stone rings, dolmens, or bullion stones, which will be the clear, turn lens off, go. So where do we find dolmens, bullion stones, rings? All along the Atlantic seaboard. And that's it. There are others around the world, but those are the main areas, at least certainly like the Irish ones. And that then brings us back to the Fomorians, because that was their domain, the Atlantic domain. They were the sea peoples. And we'll find often, but interestingly there, the next slide which I'm going to do is it this one? Yes. There is an example. An example of dolmens, bullion stone, temples, at least 2,000 to 3,000 BCE. And look where it is, the Azores, 1,000 miles out to sea. They were capable. I'm not going to read it all there, but the thing there, basically, that's where they found the amount of Neolithic things they found in the area is scary. And they relate them all to Irish portal tools connecting, which is coming through to the Fomorians again. Right. Communal stone circles. I do not believe they were used for worship. They were not used for destroying people, for blood sacrifices, or any of those things. It just does not fit in. You know, you don't go and murder your brother or your cousins or your bits and pieces. It just doesn't fit. And I'm going to be a little bit facetious here. The number one point of them, I would almost say, is a partying area. People enjoyed meeting people. They were social, but they were way more than that. The circles would have been astronomical calendars. It would have shown you when the time of season to plant your crops. They would have been tied, the ones nearer the sea. There would have been points where you'd have talked and met with other people to talk about how to plant the crops or what was going on, or to just go down to the local pub and meet your friends. The circles, there were hundreds of them in Kerry alone, to give the examples. There were community gatherings, social partying, and partying. Partying I really see as important. They were aligned to what was going on. You know, they were aligned to the cosmos because you were connected to the cosmos. Everything was connected together. And they were also chosen in sites that were spiritually uplifting to us today. We have special sites we go to. We go to the beach. We go to the mountains. How many of you saw a few years ago or a few months ago, I don't know how long it is now, remember that tree in England that was cut up and all the walkers complained bitterly? They didn't worship that tree. It wasn't a sacred tree, but it was important. They connected with it. And that's exactly the same as what happened with a lot of these sites that came through. The people. This is one example which I want to use in Benane, down in Kenmare. I was there last year. They weren't huge areas, but they had huge knowledge imbibed within them. That was a great big cooking pot. That was where the people would have filled with water, thrown really hot stones in it, and cooked venison, etc., slow cooked venison. That was a party place, or a communion grace. They had to be fed, they had to be communicated. That was integral into these bits and pieces as well. How would you pronounce that, Anthony? That was the cooking pot, which is coming there. Oh, there you go. The cooking pits would have been put to good use when preparing the food for times of great celebration and summer solstice. A joint of venison or other meat such or pheasant was wrapped in straw and put into the simmering water until cooked. The meat would have been deliciously tender as it would have been braised slowly, similarly to the way we use slow cookers to cook meat slowly, but without the straw. You know, this was a sophisticated society. Just to show you how complex Birhaven is, there are 22 dolmens and other astrological bits all associated with it. And if you look at the mountain at the top, the very top, that was the two pictures at the top shows how when the sun at certain times of the year followed the mountain curve up and was important. Even the position of the Orion's belt was noted as a precursor of what was coming through. And the stones were carved to fit it. That was exactly in the right alignment to the mountain and that ring, and those would equivalent have been also bullion stones, which would have been where you'd have been connected to the spirits, the energy, the other bits and pieces. Just the same as ways you'd maybe go to a big brother to help you out with someone, they would have gone to the cosmos to help them out with someone.
A wishing stone.
A wishing stone, just as you'd call with some of your family for help. Yeah. Cosmo, help me with this. Or there's a pain in the ass over there, please do something about it. Yeah. So that's with coming through the bullion stone. And yes, they did choose lovely sites. I mean, how could you not have your soul raised just by being part of nature in some of these bits and pieces? And that's another, there was 100 odd of these rings in Kerry alone. So this wasn't just huge, we all think of Newgrange and bits and pieces. This was much more fundamental to the day-to-day living of the people. This was probably the largest stone ring in Kerry, and that is down in Kenmare itself, and it's right on the coast. And again, that would have been the gathering point of that time. Even today, on the other side of that ring, they have the wishing trees. And people still constantly put their notes and messages on that. It is still connected through even to this very day. So again, I come back. All of this is very much on the left-hand column. And again, I'm going in the next talk, if any of you still come to it, I'm going to go on to the connection to the right, and especially when it comes to the Irish Christian version on that. But respect, appreciate, and harmony are the sort of big words that would come out on the old Irish society. You notice on both sides I've left out the word love, because love is another lecture on its own, whether you're talking about eros, agape, philia, stog, pragma, philatia, mania, or ludos. Those are all categorized as different forms of love and different situations. So love has now become almost overused in as a simple word. But I think respect, if you had to choose one word only for the Brecon system or the Irish system or the rest of the world other than the superpowers, would be respect. Respect for your neighbour, respect for the land, respect for the planet. So we left before at the KG Fields. They were very agricultural, and there was a bit of copper there, but we then have an input of other peoples coming up to Ireland because the superpowers were starting to do their bits and pieces. And we find the next people who come on the scene were Parthenon. Parthenon came from Greece. Poor man. How many? 6 millennia later, or 5.5 millennia later, he's remembered for killing his parents. And I think that's a horrible thing to be, whatever thing. And he did so much more, but he had a bit of a row with control, but he's still known as that was one of his, and he was sort of ostracized in many ways from the superpower area. But anyhow, he did come, and he was after raw materials. And Ireland, because remember that geological one I showed you, all those mountains clashing together, gold being very heavy and would tend to sink lower in the mantle. When you get the mountains pushing together, brings it up nearer the surface. And that's why you find a lot of these materials in mountainous areas, which Ireland was. Afghanistan is another good example, which we come to the tin in later times. This caused a problem, a big problem. Oh yes, before I get to that. When you find a large supply of materials or a job to do, the people in Ireland would have had a reverence for the land. And he was basically taking from the land. It wasn't a fair situation. So he brought with him 3 groups of people, which we all know as, collectively, I suppose, as the Fair Blog. Fair Blog, right pronounced, right? Yeah. Typically, if you look at historians, they'll all tell you, oh, those are the bag people because they sort of wore bedders or bags or whatever else. But to me, it's blindingly obvious when you look at the other 2 names. Fair Galleon, what's that mean? Anyone? Galleon? As far as I understand it, it means swordsman or javelin and of the earth, or wounders of the earth. And the next one is Dorman from underground. The men of carrying materials, the men of digging the ground, and the men of mining the ground. We'll find these became quite important and dominant in Ireland as well. And in fact, this is probably one of the time the islands got their name, the Fire Islands. Britans, Bri from Scythian meaning fire, and Tan meaning island, because the constant trade of people coming through had to navigate and find a way. And you'll find in the south of England and in south of Ireland, big fire pits, which they didn't really know what it was for, but it's blatantly obvious. It was, if anyone's been at sea and they want to know where, especially in the dark or whatever it is, having a light to show them where the land was important. But Parthenon was being hassled a little bit by the Danians, because remember, Parthenon was one of the superpowers. They were the ones that weren't particularly liked. They're the ones that sort of said, hey, we're taking resources from you. And the Fomorians were outside of this. And so they are constantly fighting. And you find the first with Maitura was between the Fomorians and Parthenons coming through. His nephew, or next generation's Nemed, came afterwards with 300 ships to get rid of the Fomorians and attacked them in Tory Island. Failed abysmally, but still landed on the land and went forward. I think that's the time when we start to see the KG fields abandoned. That's the time when the Fomorians started to move, and you find settlements in the Orkneys, right all the way up and down the coast, the Atlantic seaboard coast, and bringing with them the dolmens, the stone circles and bits and pieces. So back to the copper, which I was mentioning, and again down in Kerry near Mizzen Head, there's Mount Gabriel. It doesn't look a whole lot, but that was the biggest copper mine in Europe and supplied a huge amount of the copper going forward. And that was one of the little fissures which they had walked through, and that would have been supplying very large amounts of copper coming through. The second big copper mine was in Switzerland. Yes, of course, Turkey has Cyprus, relatively small amounts, but Ireland, because of their upheavals, large amounts. So, Fomorians establishing roads, and the Parthenon people gathering resources to supply Mediterranean. I think I've covered that. Yeah, it was, but the only thing I want to re-emphasize was the native people of Irish would have seen this as a pillaging of the country, of the taking of the country, and that would have been causing tensions. Right, meanwhile, Parthenon and Nemed, the people were supplying Irish to the market. Bronze Age was just starting. So, to make bronze, you need to have copper, you also need to have tin. Tin is incredibly rare resource. In fact, it's rarer than gold in some places. I think at one stage there was coming through. They did have a lot of gold, but it was a very rare resource. And all the early tin, came from Afghanistan along the spice trails, effectively, and would have come on down through. So there was starting, not only had they found a lot of resources in Ireland, but they then thought, well, where else can we find these resources? And it was at that stage, I think, that people started to move across to Wales, to England. And where it comes from that is the next couple of slides, which brings me down that line of thinking. Remember, the Danans went up the rivers when Afric flooded, bringing with them farming techniques and to all the people all the way up the Danube, right across Europe. No one had come to England by this stage. They were hunter-gatherers. They still were hunter-gatherers. And it seems that farming took over very rapidly when they were shown the farming techniques, like in a generation. That was the type of scale, once they were shown how the things would moved. So, and also at the same time, the toothed Danann are starting to arrive. They've come up through Europe and they're coming into Ireland as well. So we're now starting to look again at the 4000 BC, the KG fields are abandoned, but we start to get our major monuments. New Grange comes up, and it's very, very early. In fact, it's some of the earliest of those Neolithic types we'll see in a moment. Stonehenge, 200 or 300 years later. Stonehenge, the oldest stones in Stonehenge were blue stones that came from Presley, North Wales. And it just makes so much sense that the people coming from Ireland who were farmers, we were never hunter-gatherers. It doesn't make sense that we were hunter-gatherers at any stage. We might have gathered if there was wild something to go and gather, but we came equipped with the people with farming because they'd come from the farming communities. But when they went across to England, they were hunter-gatherers at that stage. And very rapidly, the first base is probably in North Wales, and I think that's one of the reasons why the blue stones in Presley were created in rings there. Following the ring structure, the same ideas, they then moved that down to a bigger area. Because once the farming technology, all the advantages of the advanced society got known in England, then they had regular gatherings. And Stonehenge was yes. And again, for exactly the same reasons as we have rings in Ireland, same would have been with Stonehenge. And in fact, recently they found within a mile or two of Stonehenge, huge pits of people gathering from all different areas and coming from different areas of the England or the mainland. Again, it's pretty evident that they were coming to an annual or twice annually meetings. This was think of Glastonbury, but a whole lot more. And that is, I think obviously all the other bits and pieces. So, were the Irish Celts? We're all being told they were Celts, but probably not. Because all of the invaders, if that's the word using the Gabba Labana, from Cessair and the Fomorians, the Parthenon, the Nemid, the Fearblog, Teodosin, and what will come to the Mid-Asians, they were all related. They all were Scythians. They were all coming from the same stock originally. You'll have a little break from me for another 3 minutes or 4 minutes, and I won't touch the screen.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the study of antiquity and the Middle Ages. As always, I am your host, Nick Barksdale, and I'm bringing you another segment of History Today. History in our own time, news relating to historical and archaeological findings that are changing the way that we view the past. Irish Central, which is an awesome online blog, has recently published a very intense and controversial article titled "Ancient Bones Reveal Irish Are Not Celts After All." Now, before you freak out on me and lose your minds, I was pretty skeptical when I saw this tagline as well. Okay, anyone who knows me knows that I love Irish and Celtic history, but stick with me because we're going to go through this. A 2016 discovery in County Antrim could completely alter the perceptions that Irish people are descended from the Celts. This resulted by the chance findings of ancient bones under, of course, an Irish pub in the mid-2000s. This discovery came in 2006 when renovations were being done, when a gentleman by the name of Mr. Curry noticed a large flat stone buried beneath the surface. He investigated further, and he found a corpse of skull and bone. It turned out to be the remains of 3 humans, and after calling the police, an intense investigation began to unfold. It turned out that this was actually the location of an ancient burial site, which caught the attention of a variety of experts around the globe. Who doesn't want to participate in an excavation in ancient Ireland? A prominent number of professors from highly esteemed universities throughout the British Isles participated in analyzing the bones and said that this discovery can not only rewrite Irish history, but also ancestry. DNA researchers found that these 3 bodies are the ancestors of the modern Irish people, and they actually predate the arrival of the Celts on Irish shores by around 1,000 years. Essentially, as many people have believed all along, Irish DNA existed long before the arrival of the fathers of Europe, often called the Celts. What is even more fascinating is that these original Irish ancestors may have come to Ireland from none other than the biblical lands of the Middle East. They may have arrived in Ireland by routes coming from the South Mediterranean and would have brought a variety of materials and supplies, including cattle, cereal, and ceramics. The proceedings of the National Academy of Science, otherwise known as the PNAS, said in 2015 that the bones strikingly resemble those of contemporary Irish, Scottish, and Welsh peoples. A legend to us all. Archaeologist and historian Dr. Barry Cunliffe said that the DNA evidence based on those bones completely upends traditional view. Radiocarbon dating used determined that the ancient bones date back to at least 2000 BC. Dan Bradley, a genetics professor at Trinity College, said that this could basically challenge the popular belief that Irish people are descended from the Celts. He also went on to say that the genomes of the contemporary people in Ireland are older, much older than we previously thought. And now, before you lose your minds and you begin to throw coffee and apples or whatever else you may have at your TV screen at me, I want to point out a few things. So,
Right. Coming on, I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to go very quickly. This is the next huge thing to attack the Bronze Age collapse. There could be a whole talk on this alone, and it happened in a very short time, about 1200 BC. And there's another short video to come up, and you'll see the drought, earthquake, social unrest, system collapse. I'm going to add to that an over-reliance on Phoenician naval abilities. It'll make sense in a few moments when you think of it. They didn't have navies to defend themselves, the superpowers. I think that's an important bit. And I also think the other one that's worth putting in there is there was definitely the haves and the have-not. The superpowers were definitely a society apart. And I think as soon as the people outside, especially the Fomorians, saw that there was all the things that did happen, they saw the weakness, and everybody came in, including the Sudanese from below, the Mongols. They all started to come in with the superpowers. There was a certain dislike of those superpowers, of the empires at that time. So I'm going to run on. One interesting, one of the Sea Peoples. This is a time when a lot of people, a lot of new nations were being created. It set society back. literally maybe 1,000, possibly even 1,500 years, this overthrow that happens. The Peliset, one of the sea peoples, we know them by the Philistines today. And I think this will come on through. As I said, system collapse. I hopefully I've covered most of that. Those were the sea peoples. The Weshesh, nobody really knows what it is. I'm pretty sure the Weshesh were the Fomorians. Everything down to the horned helmets, which the Fomorians went on to become the Vikings and coming on through because that's within their domain. So let's go with this other one, another break for 5 minutes plus. Can you turn the volume down a bit? Maybe just a fraction.
When looking into the Bronze Age collapse, some of the first things that come to mind when an average person looks into this topic is that sea people were a significant factor in what helped cause the destruction of so many large and powerful empires. And I would say that you're not wrong, but also not right. What I mean by this is that while the sea people do play a role in the collapse, I could only say that they were just a part of a perfect storm of events that would, in the end, destroy so many long-living empires. A look into the ancient world would have you think that they were not as connected as we are today, with our incredibly globalized world. But that's where you would be wrong. The New Egyptian Kingdom, the Hittite Empire, the Assyrian Empire, and the Mycenaean kingdoms had created a complex amount of trade routes that were needed for the survival of each of the kingdoms. These different kingdoms each brought something to the table. The Assyrian land was the breadbasket of the ancient world, where they grew many cereal crops, particularly barley, which was made for flour and beer. They were vital for feeding large parts of the ancient world at that time. Now, the new Egyptian kingdom also had large amounts of agriculture along the Nile, but the southern half of the kingdom had gems, gold, and silver. And while these vast amounts of mines gave them great wealth, the minerals to have at the time were tin and copper, which of course made bronze. Bronze was the main item made in tools, weapons, and many other important aspects of life at this time. The Hittites lived in the mountains of Anatolia, which happened to be important areas for mining copper and tin. The Mycenaean kingdoms were a more specialized people as they produced many luxury items such as carved gems, jewelry, vases, precious metals, and glass ornaments, to name a few. As you can see with the complex network of trade that was established, when one of these fails, it can lead to a whole network starting to fall, as these kingdoms depended on each other for these supplies. But this was just one part of the perfect storm to hit the Bronze Age kingdoms. Nothing destroys a nation like natural disasters. And in 2014, from Israel and German researchers had found core samples taken from the Sea of Galilee, and they had determined that from 1250 to 1100 BC was, quote, the driest of the entire Bronze Age. Or in other words, a mega drought. And if you also did not know, the Mediterranean has lots of earthquakes, which continue to build up on top of the already devastating mega droughts that were occurring. The grain-producing kingdoms, including the Assyrians and Egyptians, were largely spared from the mega droughts due to them being next to the Nile and Tigris River. But at this time, this meant that fewer grains were being produced, which limited the whole region's ability to feed their own people and export that grain to other kingdoms. At the same time, in places like Cyprus and in the Hittite Mountains, there were mines that were running out of necessary minerals to create bronze. This creates an even bigger gap for such things as farming, warfare, and mining. The region-wide drought and mining predicaments led us into one of the most famous and likely final nail in the coffin of the many Bronze Age kingdoms. Nobody truly knows where the so-called sea people came from, but most historians would agree with the major drought and disasters that exploded in and around this region made for a large amount of wave of refugees seemed to have spread to the other kingdoms, causing them to be overloaded with already existing problems. One by one, the kingdoms losing access to each other's trading and resources, too began to fall. The only kingdom that seemed to be able to weather the storm was the Egyptians, which did write that their pharaoh at the time, Ramses III, led a successful defense against the sea people attacked. Though they survived, it was in a much weakened state. An interconnected system, natural disasters, resources disappearing, and an invasion of people created the perfect storm, as I'd like to say, that combined to help the downfall of some of the biggest civilizations at that time. The Mycenaeans and Hittites both suffered a complete collapse, and with about only 1% of the people that could really read or write, their knowledge was completely lost. The Egyptians and Assyrians faced a tough road ahead, but did not face such complete collapse as the other kingdoms. In those places that faced collapse, it took centuries for writing to come back, as for an example in Greece, where it took the Phoenicians bringing their alphabet for writing to make a comeback. And though the Bronze Age had ended, this led to new adaptations by the surviving kingdoms, which included the widespread use of iron.
Right, one of the Ramesses III had went into great detail. Their first attack on Egypt was in 1200 and successfully kept them off. There was another attack that wasn't quite so successful in 1177. The most interesting ones of the peoples, which is you saw briefly there on the screen, and could be another whole talk, so I'm trying to keep it. But the interesting, the horned invaders, helmets with horns. Remember back to the original houses of Catholic with the horns, the veneration of the bull, right forward, the Fomorians coming on forward to the Vikings, etc. Those horns have been a sort of symbol coming right on through. But and I also mentioned earlier on Cappacinterunt, or Cappacinterunt, I think it was, which was the Israelite area. One of back to the Gabaglabeana, the Irish documents, the chief, son of the chief architect or the leader of those people was Nell. And he married Pharaoh's daughter, Scotta, and they had, their son was Gaedel Glass, which we all now know as Gaelic, effectively, where the word Gaelic originally came from. There's lots of talk about what happened, but certainly they left Egypt. Let's cut it all short and just say they left Egypt at that stage, same time as the Israelites left as well. They went to the Riparian Mountains. No one really knows where the Riparian Mountains is. They call it a mythical place. But I suspect the Riparian Mountains was back up into where these Gobastan area, up in those high mountains area in the Scythian coming through. Whether it was or not is another relevant. But the Maotic marshes, they do know. That is now basically the Ukraine, between Ukraine and the Black Sea area. So he made there, they spent a few years, but then they made their way to Spain. And once they got to Spain, they were heading back effectively to where their kin always was. In other words, back into Ireland, which is where the society had moved, and they'd all come through from Northern Ireland. And the father of the next crew died before he reached Ireland, but he was Mill, or Meneses. And it is there we now start on a monarchy, or kings, coming to Ireland. They invaded Ireland, and properly invaded Ireland. In fact, we were an Iberian colony. Anyone who looks at Ptolemy's map, which was done about 1,000 years later coming on, will see it's called Iberia, not Hibernia, missing the H, it was Hibernia Britain. It really was the Spanish Britain. The Romans didn't come and invade Ireland because they already had all the resources they needed through Spain and through the connection and tacit. I'll talk about that next time. That's coming through. So, but there was Eth, which was Mill's brother, basically said, look, do not invade the country. It is literally heaven on earth. Everything's working well. There's no warfare, there's no fighting, there's no nothing. But he went anyhow. And I'm cutting a whole lot short. And they declared that from then onwards, the monarchs of Ireland would have come from one of his 3 sons or from the uncle's son. And every monarch has to be descended from that line. So, but monarchy didn't fit or doesn't fit well with the Irish version of everyone being equal and shared, because monarchy is a pyramid. And that sort of then becomes gets assimilated into the Irish system. So the Irish Brehons continued their own tribal way, we're using their own sort of home parliament, but there was an overarching new layer put in, which became the Kings of Ireland, etc., come through. And they assimilated the 2 systems quite well, effectively. The Fomorians at this stage really were pushed out of Ireland. And that's when I think they went off and effectively moved to Norse, Denmark, etc. Denmark, peace and quiet. They didn't have all these sea-capable people, which is what the Milesians were, and the trading just became too powerful. Now they hung on, they still planted the waters, but their real home had moved away by that stage. So here we are, 2 hours into talks, 1 hour tonight and a bit, and I mentioned for the first time the O'Sullivans. And this is where I mentioned the O'Sullivan, because this is the first time that my 9th great-grandfather actually talks about his ancestors. He declares himself to be descended from Heber. Interestingly, he puts a date on that of when he wrote to Spain, effectively through to the King of Spain, though that wasn't the king he was writing at that stage. He was basically giving his pedigree. So I'm very near the end now. There are 2 sets of dates here. In fact, there's 3 sets of dates, but 2 on the screen. The left-hand side date is John O'Hart's, and that was written about 1870, 1890, and he dated all these bits and pieces. The green date is a couple I've transcribed through, because in the Irish documents they actually talk about kings in Syria or kings elsewhere in the world, which we do know the dates of. And so the green ones are probably much more accurate in the sense of where we're coming through. And the blue are the actual monarchs. This is the O'Sullivan pedigree. So the black ones weren't monarchs, but the blue ones were monarchs, and the number was what monarch they were in the series. I think there was 135 monarchs or something I can't remember that for sure. But so these were the bits and pieces. And because I'm running late on time, I'm not going to spend much longer than that. But a couple of interesting things on the way through. Anthony, help me. The 21st called Ina Er. Oh, sorry about that. They started the Silver Shields. When you come down to Munmoyne, he was the first who wanted his nobles to wear gold, because there's lots of interesting bits and pieces. If you come down to Rothikata, anyone else help me? No, don't worry. According to O'Hart, he lived for 250 years, so I think I'd rather go on the other dates on our own documents, etc. And he reigned for 150. I think that was just to get the calendars right from his point of view. So interestingly, there is one woman in there which was for all the equality, even with the monarchs in there, and so she was still seen as queen. Not necessarily in our line, but the Red King came and killed her anyhow. But she was the queen, and probably the only monarch in Ireland at that stage, because she was of the line coming through. So again, just flicking through the millennia, or even the... go back. Yep.
So the kings, except for, they didn't have to be primarily a man?
No.
There was women as well?
Yep. Yep. No, I think there were only 1 or 2 women.
Aye, but the equality went out the window.
Equality was right through the planet. We
Not-
don't have.
not whenever you look at it like that.
It's the next lecture. Yeah, no, okay, it was, yes, from the kings. There's certainly the men were the more stronger ones, and there was the hierarchy, yes, in there. And there was much more equality in the non-pyramid system in Ireland. So you often had leaders of tribes, could have still been in Ireland, as with the rest of the world, could have been females. But there's certainly not so much in the kings. Coming down to the 91st, Olia Olam, everybody claims title back to that, and I'm basically coming up into near enough the time of Christ, which is bringing us into the next talk. And just to continue on, we actually get to the first person called Sullivan in 950 AD, or thereabouts, coming through. And it's not really used, and this will be part of the next talk, to Burra O'Sullivan, and he does a lot of trading and coming through, and he's the famous one which then fought various around Europe. And then just to come to the end, bringing it right up to date, and I've got myself one from the end at the very bottom. And for the next talk, if you want me back, I will be from the birth of Christ right up to the Norman invasion. And the image in the center, which was prevalent in Ireland, would have got you excommunicated in Rome. And I leave you to wonder why. And that image was highly revered in Ireland, but by the Norman invasion time, you would have been cast to hell forever for showing that image.
Maybe you should tell us. It's an awful long way. I've seen it. It's a very good place, but, it's not explained.
No. That's, I'm afraid, is for next time. Because there is a lot of explaining to do behind it.
But it's very...
The other point which I'm going to raise, which I think is, and I'm going to be really stand out here, once we get to the 5th century, the greatest misogynist the planet has ever known by far. And I'll leave it at that.
Very good.
Sorry for going on.
All right. Thank you, Michael. Well, I think he has given us food for thought. I'll get questions in a wee second, all right? There will be tea at the end of the evening. Now, if anybody has any questions, we'll keep them relatively short because we've been on for length of time tonight here. So, sir, yeah.
The first person came to Ireland roughly about 600 BCE to 560 BCE.
No.
Okay.
First people to come to Ireland was 5,700 BCE.
Say that again.
5,700 BCE.
So that'll be roughly about 3,700 BC.
No, about 7,500 years ago.
7,500 years ago?
Yeah.
7,500 years ago is 5,500 BC.
Yes.
Okay. Now, that may account for the inhabitation of the changing fields. It's stated around about 6,000 BCE.
Yeah.
But Mount Sandal is stated over 9,000.
Correct. And the reason for that, I mentioned it in the last talk there, and it's also mentioned in the McAllister's, the Gabalabana Erin. There were like Lugand, the 3 names are mentioned. People regularly came from Spain for the summer and gathered resources. They never, according to our ancient documents, people certainly came to Ireland. There were people who were settled, but they were mostly summer settlements.
But surely they were the first people who came to Ireland, wasn't the ones who came later on?
They were not in our records, because they weren't permanently here. They had their families in Spain, and according to our history, and that's what I've taken all my work from, and I'm not saying it's right, but I believe it to be right, there were certainly people there, but even in Mount Sandal, they think it was a seasonal settlement.
A seasonal settlement, you're quite right, within Ireland,
Within Ireland, yes.
not outside Ireland.
No, Mount Sandal was, Sandal's up.
The people who came to live in Mount Sandal didn't come to Mount Sandal for the summer holidays and back to Spain again or back elsewhere. They stayed in Ireland. So they were the first people to come to Ireland.
Well, okay. As I understand it from the Irish records, and listen, we're all into the speculation here coming through, but according to the Irish records, before the Cessa came, there were people who came regularly to get things such as eels or exotics or whatever, who came up there for the fishing is actually an also important area. Beyond that, all I can do is I have taken the records that we have produced ourselves and based all my knowledge adding on to what we have added beyond it. Whether or not there were other things. The other point which is worth mentioning is the people that did have the technology to come and bring substantial amounts of materials with them, bringing cows with them, bringing with metalworking, bringing farming with them. And there's no sign of any of the living things that came later.
The point I reckon is that the people in Mount Sandal were living in Ireland while living in Mount Sandal or all
So where were they living when they weren't in Mount Sandal?
Say it again.
Where were they living?
They believe they were living in Ireland, somewhere in Ireland.
Have they found? But that's my question. Are there any settlements?
I only go by radio Clogging Dale. I don't make things up. I just whatever the Clogging Dale says, that's it. And they were there around about 9,000 BC.
I'm not arguing in the slightest they weren't there, but I think my question is, if they were only spending the summer in Mount Sandal, where were they spending the winter, and why? And if we haven't found it, and if there's no evidence of there anywhere else earlier, whereas that's on the one balance. On the other side of the scale, we have our records that tell us that they came seasonally.
I think we're not going to settle this tonight.
No,
anyway.
no. Yeah.
Some of us even go up and go over Mount Sandal Bridge to Port Rush regularly at the minute, and only stay for a week or 2 weeks or whatever it is. Thank you, Michael, for your talk. It has, I'm sure, given you plenty of thought. It's a subject really which people don't go. I have found that in the study of Irish history, the efforts really are from about basically from 300 AD on is the area that we mostly concentrate on. So it's elucidating there to get someone to go back and look at it from so far away. And that was the whole idea of Michael's talk. It's not, we are inclined to look at a relative, when we look at the history of the world or the history of Ireland, we're only looking at really a fairly small area in terms of, say, less than 2,000 years. Now, our next talk, we go back into the 19th century again, which more people would be familiar with, and Donald McAnallen will be giving a talk in March on basically on the famine period and people who were landlord assisted to leave Ireland during the famine in 46 and 47, and we have researched the fact we have now located the 2 or 3 of the ships who took people away from this basically area, mostly to North America. Again, I can't go into detail with it at the minute because Donald will be doing that talk. And it's interesting because an awful lot of the names of the people, we have the names of the people who were on those famine ships. And the names are names that are familiar in in County Armagh, County Tyrone at this point in time. So that'll be the next talk. You'll get details of that in due course. There is tea down there for anyone who wishes to get a cup of tea. I thank you very much for your attention tonight, and I thank Michael for his continued research into this particular subject. And it's extremely interesting to look beyond the box, look beyond the picture. Thank you very much for your attendance tonight, and it's not a great night. Anyone who hasn't who's paid their membership and not got a journal, contact me and I'll give them a journal. Again, thank you very much for your attention tonight. Okay, I didn't.